Okay, we jumped ahead a little bit. So today I want to welcome on Blind Ambition, Conrad Irwin, the Chief Technology Officer of Superhuman. Now, when you work for a company called Superhuman, you know this is gonna be cool. This is gonna be awesome. It has to be awesome. With that kind of name, we have to live up to it. So I think, Rick, you want to maybe kind of give a little bit of a brief introduction for Conrad, then he could jump in and tell us all about, what he does?
Right. So Superhuman is the buzzy service. You've likely heard of it if you've worked in tech that helps people control their email inbox with scheduled messages, follow-up reminders, and automated workflows. If you're a Ruby developer, you're likely familiar with Conrad already. Before founding Superhuman, he was part of the core team of the code exploration tool Pry. Thanks for coming on the show, Conrad.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start there. Can you walk us through your career? Like, why did you decide to move to the States, join a startup? What was that experience like?
Yeah. So the first company I came over here for was called Reportive. It was also an email tool, a plugin to Gmail. And then at the time I was in the UK. So I graduated in the UK. I had a girlfriend there. And I got this job offer from a friend who's like, hey, do you want to move across the world and join our startup in San Francisco? And my initial thought was no. But then I started thinking about it some more, and I talked to some people, and a couple of things changed my mind. One of which was I knew I was going to be a software person, right? I've been doing this for a long time. It was very fun. I felt like I was good at it. And if you want to be excellent in your field, the best way of doing that is to co-locate yourself with the other excellent people. And I feel like there's no place in the world still, other than San Francisco, that really has that brand, particularly for consumer software and building that. So co-locating was important. And the other thing that made me say yes was they said, oh, you can just go for 6 months. It's just a job. You can come back if you don't like it. And so as I've told everyone since, yeah, I'm just here for 6 months. I've just stayed an extra 12 years so far. And so, yeah, it's great being here and being close to people.
I just realized that's a great recruiting tool. Just to say that, oh yeah, you know what? Don't worry, 6 months, try it out. Because then once you get your foot in the door and you kind of moved across the, to a whole other country, it's hard to say, all right, I'm going to leave and go back to England, right? So you kind of stuck. So,
exactly.
Yeah, I think I'm going to use that more often. Hey, you know what? Just take the job. If you want to stay at 6 months, that's cool. Otherwise, you could leave.
I mean, so obviously you stayed. What happened during those first 6 months? I mean, you probably were a little skeptical still, even after moving.
Yeah, it was interesting. So a couple of things happened. One of which is that the company was doing very, very well. So Reportive was primarily a user acquisition play. It was back in the days where that was a way of building a company. And the user numbers were just going through the roof. People loved being able to connect with people, loved being able to make that connection within the product. And so there was that feeling of like, oh, I'm part of something that could be big. And so that was a big motivator. Once I got used to some of the things like crossing the road and looking the other way, I began to realize there's a fun attitudinal difference, right? I find that San Francisco particularly is a very forward-looking place. It's like, well, what could be? Whereas the UK, at least the parts of it I was in, were very backward-looking. Like, oh, it was so good back in the old days. And so that attitudinal shift, coupled with like the motivation I was getting out of being part of this company, both pushed me over, okay, no, this is where I want to be for a while. And then it wasn't until many years later I committed of like, okay, this is where I'll probably be forever. But definitely was no rush to go home.
I mean, just out of curiosity, because do you think maybe America is still a pretty young country, relatively speaking, that back in England is more of a, well, back in my day, this is what we did, and this is how we've always done it, because it's so steeped in tradition? I never really thought about it. Is that a thing?
I think to some extent, yeah, because you grow up and there's like castles everywhere. It's like, who could build a castle anymore? We don't know how to do that, right? And there's like all of this cool old stuff. And you're right, America just hasn't had the time to build them yet. And so in some ways that's to its credit. Like, we're about to build things. That's kind of the way that it's thought of here. And I like that positivity. It's really fun to be a part of.
It's also, think about it, you probably noticed this here in the US, it's almost like we keep changing. Like when you see people, different colors, different races, different religion, from different countries. So it always feels like something is new here and something's evolving. So I don't know if that also plays into the energy factor.
Yeah, I could do. I'm not sure. San Francisco is definitely a very, like, there's a lot of people here and they're
Yeah.
all here for a really important reason. But that reason's very different for everyone. And I feel
That's
like that really pushes the culture forward.
Yeah. Well, San Francisco is kind of a little hubbed into itself, right? In terms of it's a kind of different ecosystem.
Yeah, I don't have any experience of the
Yeah.
America outside. I've gone to visit, but really I've lived in San Francisco the whole time.
You haven't traveled and seen?
I've seen places, but you don't really get a feel unless you live there.
All right. So after this, another podcast we'll have is where to go in the US. So Conrad's road trip of where to go, what to see, all the cool stuff.
Exactly.
I mean, speaking of all the like cool things along the way, like you have quite a bit of a journey. You obviously have a lot of open source projects in the past. I mean, how has that helped build your career?
Yeah, definitely earlier on, since Superhuman, I haven't really had the time to do anything else.
Sure.
But earlier on, the open source was good for two reasons. Primarily practice. One of the things that's amazing about open source is you're usually building a thing for yourself. And so you get this like super tight feedback loop where you're like, I want to make this thing, and then you try and use it, it's not great yet, and you keep iterating. And that's the best way of practicing. So I think particularly as a young engineer, like figuring out how to do the engineering and the programming piece, the open source is super helpful there. And then secondly, and this is again, like after moving to San Francisco, I was collaborating with the Pi people in IRC, and one of them was like, hey, we're doing a meetup like tomorrow and you want to come? And so I went from having this kind of small online community to because everyone's here, being able to stretch that out into a community of people I actually knew. And so it both helped me with the programming side of stuff, and then also very early relationship building and kind of finding a group of people to be peers and friends with.
Would you recommend others take on open source work, or like get on Git and kind of do that?
If you have an itch to scratch it. That would always be my advice. Like don't go looking for someone else's problem to solve, because then you won't get the feedback loop, right? What you really want is to be able to just like work on something and then see if it's good yet and continue that loop. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of intentional practice as the best way of improving at a skill. But the idea is you do something, you reflect on how it went, and then you kind of repeat, and that's how you get better. Just repeating over and over again without thought doesn't help. And so I think the best way of doing that, particularly if you're newer to engineering, is to find something that you really want solved and to give it your best shot at solving it.
So as you're hiring for Superhuman, are you quite keen on folks that have like the side projects or the open source projects?
It definitely helps. So, it depends on kind of like what level we're looking at. I feel like once you have maybe 2 or 3 years of actual experience, like pretty much nothing else matters that much. But when we're looking for interns and people who are new to the role, it's looking not just for people who've just done a boot camp that's relevant, but also people who've done a degree that's relevant. That's nice, but what's really powerful is like internships or side projects. So like, again, that demonstration of practicing, because I think that really steps people who want to improve will do those things. And so that really helps you find them.
Do you find as a co-founder and a CTO now, you still have the time to practice code and like how often are you actually coding?
It depends. So, we can talk more about the CTO role, but I've jumped in and out probably every year or so. I go from being a manager to an IC to a manager again. So in the early days, lots and lots of code, and that was great fun. This year, I have done nothing with the exception of one small fix. I made the development environment work on the M1s, and I was like, that's great. But no, not really, unfortunately.
Do your direct reports ever get like nervous or like look at your code, you think?
Yeah, I definitely get questions like, why is this like this? I don't know, seemed like a good idea in 2015. Feel free to change it.
I mean, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but how much of the actual code of Superhuman is still yours?
I don't know. I mean, mostly we've just had so many people working on it. I can't imagine it's more than like 10-ish%. But because I think this happens with any project, because it was like the first 10-ish%, it's also the patterns that everyone has copied. And so, yeah, probably not much by lines of code, but a lot by structure and kind of influence, if that makes sense.
Right.
So Conrad, so you kind of pivoted to more of a managerial role. How does that feel? Do you appreciate that more or less? How do you feel?
Yeah. I've kind of made that pivot twice now. The first time mostly accidentally. So in the very early phase of the company, kind of working hands-on, building the first version of the product, then realized, okay, we need a team. So hiring and managing that first version of the team up to maybe 8 people. At that point, I was still tied to the code. I really liked to code, and B, not really thinking about management in a growth-oriented way, I would say. And so I don't think I did a very good job of it the first time around. So what we ended up doing is hiring an engineering manager, and that let me step back into kind of more of a technical role again. We went and did the kind of like the same transition again a few years later. We had another gap on the management side. It's like, great, I'll take this over. But this time really like reflecting on how it had gone the last time and thinking of like, okay, there's a whole new set of skills to learn. And I've done a whole bunch of kind of manager trainings and books over the last few years, but particularly jumping into this role again and I work with a management coach to just like talk these things through really helps. Because kind of, I don't know, the way I think about it, at least, of just like both programming and management as skills. Programming, the feedback loop can be super tight. Like as you just save, does it work? Yes, great. With management, the feedback cycle is super long, right? Okay, we're going to make a change. I'm going to give some feedback. It may be a few weeks before you can be like, oh yeah, that feedback landed, or this change is actually an improvement. And so having someone who you can workshop with, again, is a way of how do you shorten the feedback cycle? How do you intentionally practice this? And so going into it with that kind of a mindset and really owning it has made it a lot more fun for me, because it's a skill where I feel like I can see myself improving, instead of previously it was a skill where I was reluctantly doing it instead of coding. But having made that mindset shift, it's actually really fun.
It's so interesting, Rick, because we've spoken to people. This seems like a common thing. And let's take sports, for example. You could be a great footballer, and then let's say part of your career is like, all right, I don't have that many years left, and you want to transition into be a coach or manager. And people just believe, oh, okay, you want to do that, you can be a great manager because you're a great player. And oftentimes you become a manager and you're not so great because, like you're saying, no one is teaching you what to do. And for some reason, people just think you can automatically know how to manage people and make it happen. And often, we'll see here, let's say in the business world, a lot of times they fail because no one is teaching and mentoring it. And it's interesting that you point out you went and got a mentor to say, hey, if I'm going to manage, I got to do it right. I got to figure out what to do, how to do it, and be the best I can at it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's a really interesting transition, because management is a set of skills, and it is a distinct set of skills from programming. But it's also a set of skills that's much more subtle. Yes. Like a lot of them are people skills and awareness skills and things where you can't really point, like with programming, it's like, look, you just wrote that code, it's there. With management skills, it's a lot, at least for me, very cerebral and internal, of like, okay, I'm observing these things, like what does that mean I have to do next? And so it's very hard to point to management skills and say, oh, if only you were better at spelling, right? There's no like obvious next step. And that's where having someone who's done it before and who's very good at it can really help. Be like, okay, you're observing these things, like think about this and think about it in this way before acting. And that's really helpful.
How has that experience influenced how you kind of see professional development at Superhuman? Have you like built these kind of like mentorship or made this coaching available to your team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of ways in which we do that. Obviously, it's a little bit different depending on the people. But we have regular we call them leadership offsites, but they're usually half focused on planning, half focused on workshops. We also have a coaching budget for everyone of like, I can't remember exactly what the amount is, but it's like, here's the budget, use it for books or learning or conferences, coaching, whatever. And we make sure that the people who need coaching have access to the right people. We've worked a bit with companies like Plato who do that kind of stuff as well. And so I think it's different for everyone. I know that coaching has worked super well for me, and I know that other people learn in different ways. But one of the things that's really important Superhuman is like, how do you, kind of to the intro, how do you live up to that name? Right? You continually improve. And so helping everyone be in a place where they're continually improving is really important.
So speaking of Superhuman, we jumped the gun a little bit. Maybe you could share a little bit about Superhuman, what it's about, why people should use it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the very long-term vision, which is that we want to make every professional get to the end of every day feeling happier and more productive. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think happier is a key thing. I've used a lot of software that doesn't make me happier. I would prefer not to. So really making things that are a joy to use is very important to us. And then the other piece is more productive every day. These aren't just tools that you learn once and you're done. They're tools with depth. I think a really common example would be a Vim or an Emacs. You can start using them, but the more you use them, the better you get. And so trying to build that kind of an experience into Superhuman as well is really important. So zooming into the short term, what does that look like? Well, we started the company with this idea of productivity in mind. We went and we asked 50 or so of our friends, what's one thing that slows you down at work? Where are you really unproductive? And we got back a pretty resounding set of answers, which was email, 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 email. And so that framed the conversation. Obviously, we had some experience from Rapportive working in the email space. And it became obvious to us that rather than a plugin to Gmail, because plugins can really only make things more bloated and slower, we really needed to flip and do something completely new. And that would let us really play in this like joyful to use, delightful experience place. As well as really focusing on that speed aspect that's really important to us. So that's what we've been doing for the last 5-ish years. We are actively growing that, and that's a successful business. And we're beginning to talk internally about what is the next tool, but I will leave that in suspense for the next time.
So you mentioned like asking for your friends to kind of come up with like the initial idea. As a technical founder, how do you translate those ideas and those like pain points into actual product or actual code?
Yeah, for me, the real answer is lean on Rahul. So Rahul's the CEO at Superhuman, and he is a phenomenal product thinker, someone who can really do that distilling very well. But it was interesting kind of having those early conversations of like, okay, so email is what people are frustrated about. Why? Mostly because they spend too much time doing it, and or they feel like the signal to noise is too low, right? Those are kind of two ways of saying the same thing. So we went and we looked at Gmail, like what are the small things? What are the small things that take too long? And it's little things like when you archive an email, it just kind of kicks you back to the inbox. So you have to then open the next email. What if instead of that, you open an email, you archive it, the next email is already there, right? It doesn't feel like much, but you're avoiding that context switch back and forth. And that really helps with the mental burden of going through things because there's just less to do. One of the other things that we've experimented with but have not really pushed for is, there's a lot of ML and AI powered stuff happening. Like, do people want that in their email? It turns out the answer is no. People really don't trust it. Like, I don't trust it to make good decisions. I don't want it to be, emailing on my behalf. And so what we really do is, empower the user to make the choices they need to make and do nothing else. So really surfacing to you the decisions and make you in control, but try and get rid of the slowness and the noise that otherwise happens. That was a long answer. Hopefully that got at what you're asking for.
No, that makes sense because I think the community on Blind, they often have great ideas, right? They feel the pain points in their day-to-day lives, and that's kind of sparks the side projects and the startup ideas. But I think they're often blocked and they say, great, I have these ideas. I think it could work, but they kind of don't know what to do next, right?
Yeah. And I think, the other thing that I kind of glossed over is it takes a long time, right? If you're, particularly for Superhuman, but I think for any idea, the chances are you have something that kind of solves your problem and you want to make something that solves it better. Implicit in that is you need to rebuild the thing that solved the problem in the first place. And so for Superhuman, we probably worked on the code base for about 2 years before we got to more than 10 or 15 friends users, because we had to build not just a better email client, but we had to build an email client to start with, and there's a whole bunch of complexity in there. And so I think, and this is maybe just projecting a little bit from the question you asked, I think one of the things that often gets in the way is the notion that, it's just a small change. And so it should be easy. And I find time and time again, like both with Superhuman and watching friends go through this, it takes so much longer than you think to get to something valuable, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but does mean that it really that perseverance and that like ability to to surround yourself with supportive people who care about the same thing and work on it together, that really helps.
When did you start seeing kind of the fruits of your labor? Like, when did you kind of figure out like, oh, okay, this 2 years of coding is worth it. It's coming along.
Yeah, well, one of the things, if you search Superhuman, you'll find we have a lot of writing on our product market fit framework. And this was really our way of keeping going for 2 years, which is we'd very slowly add people. They were usually friends, and we would ask them very targeted questions. Because the problem with adding friends to your product is they're very supportive. They're like, yeah, this is great. It's like, well, that's not helpful. Like, why is it great, or what's missing is what you're really trying to get to. And so we continually would survey people. We continually get the feedback. And I'd say for the last 6 months of that, we were probably adding one person every week. And we would add them. We would find any crashes that they caused, fix those. We would get their feedback survey, and we would fix the problems there. And then we'd add the next person. And it's like, great, they have a different set of problems. And over iterating on that theme over and over again, you begin to realize, because you're asking both what are the problems and also what's great, you get this like continual stream of like, it's amazingly fast. I feel so productive. It's amazingly fast. And so at least for me, I'm very motivated by making people happy. Like it's kind of a simple one, but just to see, oh, this is really helping these people. That's very helpful.
Conrad, from a mental health perspective, if it took, when you're in that in-between time, and Rick was alluding to that, how do you kind of keep that momentum when it's like, okay, one person signed up, another, that has to be pretty tough, right? Where you have these goals that you want to hit and you want to achieve, but it just takes so long. How do you stick with it?
Yeah, some of it was expectation setting up front. Like we went into this knowing it would take a while. It took a lot longer than we thought it would still. I think we said, about a year seems about right to build an email client. I think it was a little bit longer than that to be done or considered done. But we had a lot of debates of like, well, what should we do here? Should we just, open it up, call it freemium, make it grow? And so I think the important thing was acknowledging it. And then the second important thing was framing it as intentional and having a plan around it. So we had this notion of the product market fit framework, and that had a gate to release built in, which was if we had a certain number of people who said that if we were to take Superhuman away, they would be very disappointed. That would imply, okay, we're at a point that it's good enough to share. And I think with email, potentially with other products too, but particularly email, there's so much inbuilt behavior that it's very easy for people to be like, wow, this is great and shiny. And then after 2 days, they just stop using it because Gmail has something that they just really need. And so we were able to see kind of progress towards that number eke up slowly. We were also kind of at the same time thinking through, what does a successful business built on this look like? We could see around us the hulls of other email client startups. It's definitely not a new space. Pretty much all of them decided to be freemium. And the downside of that is twofold. One of which is that email is actually quite expensive to serve. There's a lot of data that gets transferred back and forth. And email is also very expensive to build, right? You need a big team or a medium-sized team for a long period of time to build a good product. And so we observed that all these freemium companies were going into business, and we kind of made that intentional choice. Superhuman is going to be a premium product. It's going to be for the people who really care. And that was also a good way of softening the like, why are we not growing so fast? Because we don't need to grow so fast. What we need to do is grow revenue. And we can grow revenue significantly faster than ad-based companies, right? We have an actual subscription and people pay us for the value we create. And so, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to the mental health thing other than it was hard.
Well,
a lot of
it does make
conversations.
sense. Because I guess what you're saying, you manage expectations, saying, hey, this is going to take starting out a year. So then if you know that and you have enough finance, whether VC money, family, friends money, whatever, and say, okay, I have a year to do it. So that does take a lot off because you're like, okay, there's no expectations next month. All of a sudden it's a rocket ship. So you can kind of pace yourself. And I guess if you have to really believe, is this too, that you have to just believe this is it. This is my baby. I'm going to, nurture this baby. This baby is going to grow. This baby is going to be awesome and an adult one day. And I guess that maybe takes over. And that and maybe I wonder too, is that the difference between, we always hear about the startups that succeed and do well, but then how many? You don't hear like the reports, like what are the numbers of all the failures, right? Like they're just, those numbers have to be outrageous, but we forget about them. So I wonder if that's kind of the key too, is that like, hey, I have faith in this and I'm just going to keep plugging away because I know we have the right product and I know people are going to want it and we just have to persevere.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And two of the values we look for when hiring, one of which is it's grit, I think is the word for
Yes.
it. Determination, the idea that if it gets tough, you just keep going. And the other is proactive positivity. Like you don't just go, okay, this could be good. It's like, this could be good and I'm going to make it good, right? That notion of like making things better all the time. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of it can be an approach. I think a lot of it is also idea and timing and like all kinds of things not in your control. But a lot of it is, can you really approach it with that mindset? And do you have the, particularly the financial freedom to take a year off and like get to this point?
Yeah.
I know that's something that's a struggle for a lot of people.
I'm so curious. I love that idea of interviewing and looking for grit and improvement. Do you have any advice for any like engineering candidates that are like listening? How do you demonstrate that, or how do you build grit, or how do you get to that level?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of spoiler alert, some of the questions that we ask people. So, particularly for the proactive positivity piece, we often ask people like, what's the time you made a change and it had like a negative or suboptimal outcome? And what we're looking for is both awareness of like, everyone makes mistakes, that's totally fine. But like you took that, you learned from that and you made things better, right? And it's this idea of, okay, things go wrong all the time. And that's true for everyone, but you not only owned that, you were like, okay, I'm going to make sure no one else can ever make this mistake again and go that way. And so really trying to like show that. I think determination is a bit trickier, particularly in engineering. At least the candidates that we talk to are often part of teams where they're not directly in control of like what is important to the company. And so we often ask people things like, tell me about a time where you felt like you were doing the best work of your life. Like what was exciting about that? What made it all gel? And that really gets to an idea of like, well, I really like it when things are challenging and I can kind of like work through the challenge, or I really like it when everyone is collaborating, and really trying to tease out people's values and motivations that way. So lots of behavioral questions to just get into those.
Makes sense, because if you have a small and growing team, you want to find people who are resilient, who have grit, who could deal with adversity, overcome adversity. Because otherwise, all you need is one or two people who have that negative attitude, and it just kind of permeates and infects everyone else. So it's smart to kind of flesh that out early on. And then you could get a sense of like, all right, because people could say things, but you could get a sense when you interview how they really feel. And yeah.
So, I mean, what are other kind of like typical profiles even, or what are other things that an engineer can do to kind of stand out if they were to apply?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about some of this already, but particularly if you're newer to the role, we're looking for people who are practicing. So you've had internships, you've done projects. If you've already got a few years of software engineering experience, we're not looking back. Like it doesn't matter what school you went to or which bootcamp you did. If you've been in a job for 3 years, it just doesn't make any difference anymore. So we look a little bit at kind of companies that you've been at. Again, we're still a relatively small engineering team at a medium-sized startup. And so we're looking for people who've been in roles like that before, because they also tend to self-select, right? People who enjoy that extra responsibility and that, that thrive in that little bit of extra ambiguity you get in a small company is really important to us. And we found that, that kind of background is more successful. We look a little bit at tech stacks. And again, it's tricky because it's not directly in your control usually as a professional engineer what the tech stack is. Like you just show up at a company and it is what it is. And so we mostly are using that again to try and filter out like what kind of environment have you chosen to work in, and looking for places that could translate well into Superhuman.
We often have many programmers in our community that are trying to get their first break. They might work for like a bank or an insurance company or something like that. How do those folks kind of break into tech or start at a startup? How do they demonstrate that they, have what it takes when their resume on first glance might be the exact opposite?
Yeah, we actually look quite carefully at resumes, particularly in cases like this, because there's a big difference between someone who is acting with that kind of ownership mindset and that productivity mindset versus someone who's not. And it often comes across in the way they write. So one very common thing that, at least for me, is a not a good sign is when people have this resume and they're like, I worked at big company X, I did C++ and Git and HTML. It's like, well, that's not an accomplishment. That's just like a thing. But if you have someone who says, I work at big company Y, I was responsible for this initiative that caused, either a 10% reduction in this or an extra 100,000 users a month, something where they can tie what they did to an impact that happened, right? That's the ownership mindset coming out. And so, framing that question that way is important. I think the other piece, and this is for us at Superhuman, when we interview candidates from large companies, one thing that often goes wrong, right? We ask everyone to write a small piece of software. We give them a prompt, we give them an hour and a half, they get to work on it on their own, and then we check in. It's very different when you are working on a new thing because there's no libraries and tools and framing set up. And so one of the other very, very simple things you can do is like practice writing a new thing. Like, what does it look to set up a new development environment? How do you quickly get stuff done without relying on all of the frameworks that you're used to at work? And so probably those two things would be the biggest to make sure that you're really talking about the ownership and the impact that you had, and make sure that you can actually, like, within a small amount of time, build something meaningful without the company libraries.
I mean, so Superhuman is known for its elegant design. Are you also looking for elegant or clean written code during the whiteboard assignment?
No, so we actually test for programming by giving you, like, here's a prompt. You've got your own laptop, just go build it. So we're looking for people who can set up a development environment. Well, we actually tell you to set one up in advance, but take a new development environment and build something meaningful. It's obviously very small. It's a 90-minute task. And it's really pass-fail based on, does it meet the requirements? We'll obviously look at the code quality. We'll talk about error handling and like all of those niceties. But that's really just to give us an idea of like where are potential like coaching opportunities, etc. We've never said no to someone who's got all the requirements working just because the code was a mess. Like, sometimes in 90 minutes, you don't have time to do anything else. You just type it out and this is how it is. And that's totally okay.
How hard is it to find talent now?
Well, it's an interesting question for me. So in the very early days, I was the one doing all the finding, and I found it very difficult because I'm not a natural, like, search the internet for people person. I now have a recruiting team that does this for us. I think in many ways, there are lots of people out there. It's tricky to try and find find people who are interested and people who are looking for a new change. At least for us, we found that most people we reach out to don't reply. I think that's very common. And so how do you both find the people who are looking for a new thing? You can obviously use the active platforms like Hired and AngelList. You can send out emails to lots of people. So I don't think the question is it hard? It's very time intensive and effort intensive, but you can with sufficient time and effort get it done.
A lot of companies have moved to get people in different countries. Do you do that as well?
We are currently still like plus or minus 3 hours from PST. So we have a couple of people in Mexico, a couple of people in Canada, but we're mostly US based still. There's no reason we couldn't go, further afield other than logistically time zones are more important than geographies, particularly now everyone's pretty much remote. Because
we hear from so many people, like, for instance, we were just talking to the folks from AngelList Talent because you brought it up, and yeah, they're trying to source, you name a country, they're trying to source from anywhere and everywhere. And it's because it's tough to find people. So they're like, wait a minute, let's go, to the Ukraine, where they had a lot, which unfortunately they're going through. I don't know what's happening there. It's obviously very alarming. But you name it, like, so in all these hubs you wouldn't have thought possible. It's happening. Like, there's another company we spoke with, Deal, where they're the ones who kind of do all the paperwork and all the back office compliance work to have it remote. And you're finding hubs in like Argentina and Brazil, and they're getting paid in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So it's really, these companies are trying to be really creative to say, okay, what do we do? Let's get them in different countries. Let's pay them in cryptocurrency. This is the way maybe we can find the best talent.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of an important part of particularly as you grow as a company, right? And one of the things that COVID actually really helped us with is like we've been kind of waffling about this, like, oh, do we want to go remote? It's nice having an office, and then suddenly, okay, we're all remote now. And so, although we've been thinking about it before, to have that like clarifying function of like, yep, we're going to go remote, has really opened up the number of people who are available. Because I think, prior to that, restricting yourself to just the few 100,000 people who happen to live in the Bay Area, it's quite restrictive if you consider the.
You know what? I think that's a good recruiting tool though, because Microsoft, Google, they're all telling getting back to work. You've seen it, and a lot of people are not happy for the obvious reasons. If you have, let's say, young kids, or you just all of a sudden you have your hobbies, you have a life, and now you have to go back. You're like, let me take a look at Superhuman. They're remote,
Right.
Cool company. Oh, let me do that. So I wonder if that's going to help you out when they're starting to push people to come back, and the ones who desperately don't want to go back
I
are
hope
going to
so.
look for the ones that could be the sweet spot.
I can only imagine how many inbound recruiting emails Google and Apple employees are getting right now.
Right?
Like, hey, I heard you're going to be forced to commute every day. How about you don't? No, my wife works at Apple, and it's been a lot of change. Like since pre-COVID, we had a small daughter, so I have an 18-month-old. And it's a lot. And so the idea of adding a commute into that lifestyle is like,
It's tough. And then
yeah.
you got to find childcare if you can get childcare, and it's expensive, and you don't know who's taking care of your kid. It's a lot of things you have to worry about.
Speaking of things that you have to worry about, you've mentioned this already. There's a lot of time as a CTO spent recruiting, managing your team. Are there any other things that you think some people don't know a CTO typically does, or that even surprised you?
Anything else? Well, it's interesting, right? So partly it's a CTO role, partly it's a co-founder role, and that means there's some things where no one else can do them, whether it's they don't have the skills, they don't have the want, they just like escalate it, and it's like, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to do this now.
Counter to do it. Yeah
exactly. So for whatever reason, I manage all of our IT stuff as well. Great. I know computers, that's fine. We can do this. I also run compliance, kind of similar of like, okay, well, who's going to do compliance? All right. I guess there's technical stuff involved there. Conrad, you can do that. And so kind of less facetiously, I think the role of the CTO is, and at least what the advice that was given to me is, you want to de-risk any of the technological risks. But the role of the co-founder is to be the backstop of last resort. And so you can't really ever say, I don't want to do that. If it needs to happen, it needs to happen. And sometimes all kinds of crazy stuff escalates, and it's like, oh, well, let me figure out how to either reassign this or just get it done. And so it's mostly fun, but it's kind of an odd bag of stuff.
I mean, how do you deal with the situation where something just might be new to you, and like you said, as the co-founder, you're the backstop of last resort when you might not know the answer or how to solve this, quickly or efficiently? Walk us through what's going through your head at that moment.
Well, let's take compliance as an example. Right? It came up that as we begin to sell Superhuman into companies, like they want to see SOC 2 reports. Like, okay, how do we get a SOC 2 report? Initially, and this is because I'm me, like, let's Google this and see like what can we do quickly and efficiently. And so it turns out that there's a whole bunch of just like stuff that needs to happen, and there are people who specialize in getting it done for you. And so it's like, okay, great, let me change this very big unknown, which is how do we get SOC 2, into a very small known, which is how do we find a contractor we like to work with who already knows how to do SOC 2. And so that's been a big part of it more recently, which is, as the company's grown and we have the resources to just like hire experts, like let's do it that way. Earlier on, it was a lot more like Googling and hoping. Like, okay, we have this, like one thing happens for us all the time. Like people are like, hey, my emails are going to spam. It's like, okay, there are lots of reasons emails can go to spam. Let's help you through this. And so, I'm probably now one of the foremost experts outside of Google on how the Gmail spam filter works. But it takes a long time to get there. And, trying to network within Google, trying to like Google search the internet, see who else has found what, and just like debugging all of this stuff. It's a lot of learning. Luckily, I kind of enjoy that. I like knowing how things work. So that's not been a problem for me.
I think as a executive, that helps because then you have an appreciation for what goes on in each different division. So that when going back to saying about managing, that probably gives you more empathy because you kind of understand, oh, this is not an easy fix. So if it takes that person a while to do it, you're like, all right, I remember doing that myself. And I know that wasn't so easy. So I understand why it takes a while. So I think that in a way, that's it's almost like a smart business decision to say, hey, I'm going to kind of, in the early days ish, let me kind of look at a little bit of everything so I have a feel for a little bit of everything. So then I understand and respect what people have to do every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, it's one of the main reasons I wanted to get into a role as co-founding. It's just like you get to learn so much that you would otherwise never ever know. And it's like, yeah,
it's interesting. It's interesting, Connor, because Rick had on Blind it's always fascinating to me. The story where with DoorDash, they asked everybody, every white collar person to go and deliver. And some of them were so appalled. It was asking if you would say jump off a roof. I mean, they were so aghast. But others were saying, wait a minute, that makes sense. Like, especially some engineers were saying, hey, let me do that because maybe as I get in the car and drive and deliver some food, I'm going to pick up some ideas that never occurred to me that could help make it better. If I'm on a bicycle and going somewhere, am I going to learn something that could actually make me better at my job for doing it? So that goes back to what you're doing by actually getting your hands dirty and stuff you really don't love, but figure it's in the long term, it's better. It's going to help everybody out.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying gets to another really important thing, which is you have to be a user of your own product, right? You have to figure out how to make it part of that, or at least that's how I've only ever been able to build good stuff that way. Because if you're just building things for someone else, like how do you know it works?
Exactly. Or is it really work? What's wrong? Is what's, what?
Right.
Yeah, because you really don't have a good sense of it. But if you're doing it, you realize, oh my gosh.
Yeah. One thing that really surprised me. So a few years back, I helped someone internally write a small script to send an email. I was like, great, okay, that's fine. I found out 6 months ago they're still using the same script to send emails to our whole user base, and it's like, oh no, you should have told me. We should fix this. But because I wasn't using it, they were just happy to work around all of the problems that they'd found with it over the intervening years. So I'm so sorry.
Well, how is it? Did they fix it? Did they do it on their own? Or
not yet? We're figuring it out right now. But yeah, it's really interesting. If you don't get feedback, you don't know what's wrong.
See, that goes into the compliance hat that you're wearing to kind of do an audit every once in a while and test out to see like what's going on. Wait a minute, you're using that script? I thought, I guess exactly. I should have told you not to keep using it. All right, but now we know. Let's figure it out. Let's change it.
My big theory is if you asked everyone to take a month off every year, you'd pretty quickly find a whole bunch of stuff where you're like, oh, that not only they're the only person that knows how to do that, there's a better way.
Dude, it's a funny thing on Wall Street where that's where I generally recruit for. They have you take at least a week or sometimes 2 weeks off consecutively because they want to find out like, is there not so much what you said? It's on the it's like, is there anything going wrong? Are they doing anything that now we're going to uncover? Any insider trading? Seriously, so they purposely make you take these times off so you could find that and like see, hey, is there something shady going on that person was doing? And because they're in the office, they're trying to cover it up.
Nice. Well, maybe we'll give it a go.
Yeah, now we say like, maybe now you're running through your mind, a guy, somebody who's in the office every day, all the time, like, is he just very motivated, or is there something going on?
Oh, that's fantastic. I had no idea about that practice. That's quite smart, actually.
Because you know what happened? You had a lot of these, Bernie Madoff things, a lot of these, churning accounts, you'd have all these things like someone will change the address of where you get, let's say, your dividend check to their own house. It's incredible what will happen. And then you realize like, if they're not there, you could kind of find out what happened.
Wow.
Yeah. Wall Street's a little different animal than it's a different games that go on, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, so that's the interesting thing about startups, right? Where in the early days, you're kind of scrappy. You have more like hacks rather than like features and things like that. You obviously saw this kind of transition happen almost in front of your eyes. When did you know that the script needed an upgrade, or when did you know that something we have to have a process for this?
Yeah, mostly it's retroactive, to be honest. It's like, oh, we just found out this went very wrong. Let's fix this. And so, we've occasionally kind of foreseen problems. One particularly obvious time is like, you're growing the team. Great. As we're growing the team, let's make new process. But usually what happens is, oh, we were trying to ship this thing and it took twice as long as we thought. Like, what happened? Okay, as part of that, like, let's go revisit how we work. So it's been hard to pinpoint like an inflection point. I think that it's been a continual slow, steady stream of just maturation as we've got older and bigger as a company.
So do you see that it just comes from like your experience and your judgment that you've developed over time, or do you imagine that maybe a younger programmer that's trying to start a startup, will they have the same experience, you think, of being able to find these kind of points?
Well, some of it is not me finding it. Some of it's other people being like, hey, like I noticed this thing, it's very broken. And so I guess there's two things that are important. One of which is awareness, right? You need to be able to spot things yourself. And the other of which is to be really receptive. Of like, if someone comes to you and be like, hey, I think there's a really big problem here. There is at least a problem, which is that they think there's a problem. They may have misdiagnosed it or for some context that they don't have. But the chances are there's like some communication that needs to happen or something that needs to shift to make that work. And so a big part of and this comes a lot in like all manager things, is like that egoless leadership. Like, people are going to come at you with all of the problems, and they're not problems that are caused by you or your problems, but they are problems you have to fix. And so keeping an eye on those, making sure that you're staying ahead of them, it's a lot, but it works slowly.
Got it. I think that's a good note to end on, right? Like, just having this egoless leadership, understanding you might not have all the right answers, but it's up to you to kind of do the investigation, the research, and kind of figuring it out. That's kind of a good way to level up your career, so to speak.
Yeah, I think so. At least that's what I'm doing right now. So we'll see.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Conrad, for coming on the Blind Ambition. It was amazing. You dropped a lot of lessons that I think I'm quite keen to take up on, and I'm not even a programmer.
Great. Well, thanks for
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Conrad. It was great meeting you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Take care.